everyone, Anark here. This is another Anark Abridged, and this time the topic of the video is going to be how anarcho-capitalism is not anarchist, and maybe more broadly, how anarcho-capitalism is infeasible, and even if it did succeed in doing what it claimed to do, it would actually lead to a sort of hellish dystopia. And the reason why that I've chosen this topic here is because I'm sort of surprised the degree to which anarcho-capitalism, quote unquote, or American libertarianism, as it might sometimes be called, has entered the conversation about anarchism to such a prolific degree. Or I guess I should say that I'm not surprised, because that's precisely what it was meant to do. It was meant to sort of obscure the conversation about anarchism. It was meant to inject an ideology which is directly, diametrically opposed to anarchism into the conversation about anarchism. And the same was the attempt with the word libertarian. So it was an attempt, I think, in a very conscious sense, you can even find one or two of its adherents saying as much, to obscure and steal these words away from the anarchist movement or the libertarian socialist movement, and to claim them instead for hyper-capitalism. So just to begin with, let me note that anarcho-capitalism is an economic system, essentially, where capitalism does everything in society. So anything that would have been contained in, say, a commons or the state would then instead be privatized. Everything would become owned by private entities. And we'll get to what they mean by private entities here in just a moment. But the idea is that they claim to be anti-statist. So what they conceive anarchism as being is just no state. So they don't think it has any other qualities. They think it just means statelessness or a lack of government. Okay. So I guess the first thing I should address is to say that that is false. That is not what anarchism is. That's a component of anarchism. Anarchism is opposed to the state. And you'll find lots of descriptions about anarchism being opposed to government, you might say. So that is a component of anarchism, but that is not exhaustive of what anarchism is. Anarchism, really more formally in a historic sense, is actually opposition to relations of domination. This is the way that you might have found it stated in a lot of anarchist theory that characterized the foundational theory of anarchism. The opposition to domination, that is to say, of one group of individuals or one individual subjugating another, forcing another individual to be obedient to that dominating individual. Anarchism is in opposition to those sorts of relations. And as it developed forward, I would say that it kind of, it could be more properly stated as an opposition to all hierarchical power structures. That is to say, all of those structures that are constituted through human interaction and ownership and social principles such as law and the means of production, ownership over the means of production and the distribution of goods from those means of production, being controlled by a narrower and narrower group of people. That is to say, a process of centralization of power, centralization of decision making. That is what the anarchist opposes. The anarchist seeks to destroy hierarchical power structures and replace them with structures of mutuality and libertarianism. That is to say, distribution of power among the people, socialization of the means of production, the abolition of the rule of law, and its replacement with free agreement and mutual aid. So that's what anarchism is, even if you go back to its very roots. So let's talk a little bit about why that's the case. Anarchism, you might say, kind of has two starting points. The first, in a historic sense, could be said to root to Stirner. And Stirner wrote very early on, in the early 1800s, this book called The Ego and Its Own, or The Unique and Its Property. And this gave us the beginning of anarchism. But Stirner still didn't call himself an anarchist. So we often consider Stirner to be an anarchist, but he wasn't the first person to call himself an anarchist. That came later with Joseph Pierre Proudhon. And Proudhon explicitly called himself an anarchist. In Proudhon's conception, it did indeed mean anti-government, but it meant anti-rulership more broadly. This is sort of the beginning of this broader understanding of anarchism as meaning opposition to domination or relations of domination. So it should be said, the anarchist is not satisfied with the idea that domination can be justified through some sort of rule of law. That is to say, it's not okay that domination does not become okay. Hierarchical power does not become okay because there is some rule or stipulation which says that it's okay. That is not considered a consensual interaction. Insofar as that two people cannot enter into some agreement freely of their own consent, and insofar as that there are some sort of external pressures of coercion that are involved, the anarchist says that is not a free agreement. That is an agreement that is taking place under coercion and therefore is going to be defined by domination. And this is important because we're going to come back to this here in just a minute. So both Stirner and Proudhon, who might be said to be kind of our two originating points, both opposed capitalism vehemently. They recognized that private property was a form of oppression and was a structure of domination, much in the same way that the state was a structure of domination. And back then, there would have been also a significant emphasis on religious hierarchy, the power of the clergy and monarchies, because this would have been a lot more topical to the time that they were existing in, especially in the places that they were in, which is to say mostly in Europe. So this is kind of where it began, and then it only evolved more and more into a socialist and communist political and economic philosophy. I bring all of this up because anarcho-capitalism has nothing to do with anything that I just said. Literally the only thing that it holds in common with anything I just said is that it is anti-state. But it argues, and I would say in a highly fallacious sense, that exchanges under capitalism are voluntary. And this is where this discussion we just had about insofar as there is some threat of violence or deprivation, that represents coercion. That is a form of domination. So this is where the anarchist critique of capitalism roots to. Not only this, but this is one of its central theses about why capitalism is an unethical system or is a system based around coercion, is that it essentially utilizes a threat of starvation and homelessness and deprivation in a more general sense, death in some occasions, in order to force people to accept the labor agreements that are being offered. And the anarcho-capitalists like to say, well, that's a consenting labor agreement. They're not the ones who, made the universe, full of scarce resources. They're not the person who's starving you. They're just offering you a way out, is what they say. There are a couple of problems with this. Problem number one is that the capitalist system relied on actually enclosing many of the ways that people would have been able to provide for themselves and others outside of the capitalist system. That is to say, the capitalist system began, or not began, but really escalated into its full modern form through enclosure of the commons and giving over those commons, accumulating that power in the hands of the capitalists. Giving over, all of those things which were once communally owned, or you might actually say owned by no one, and then giving them over to private entities. And this is a process that took place in a lot of different places, in a lot of different ways. And so really, it all began with a process of accumulation. Now, there are some places where this began as a sort of in embryo without any such seizure like that. I've mentioned this in a few of my videos, the beginning of capitalism in these sort of low countries of like Italy and surrounding nations, in the early burgs or borgs, or however you want to say it. And this is true. This is partially where it arose. But what happened is, over time, the capitalist system sort of took over. It quantized all of the systems of domination, and it coordinated with the monarchist class. It coordinated with the states in order to make sure that it had absolute dominance and that the market took over everything. And so there was really never a point wherein like humanity entered a voluntary contract with capitalism. Capitalism as a system has been forced on us. That's sort of, I think, the big difference in understanding here is that the anarcho-capitalist thinks of these as all being these just like one-to-one little voluntary relations between the laborer and the capitalist. And we'll get to why this is exploitative here in a moment. But it's not. The laborer doesn't have another option but to take labor contracts. All labor, all fulfillment of necessary social needs has to be done through corporations. It's not as if they could have chosen otherwise. It's not as if they could have chosen, to go participate in a communist society or participate, under anarchist relations. That's not available. Therefore, there's no way for anybody to opt out of capitalism. They're always just choosing between a series of competing labor contracts, all of which are agree to this contract or starve. That is always, always the foundational threat of every labor contract under capitalism. And that fundamental threat is essentially why capitalism is based in coercion, inherently based in coercion, because there is not an alternative. There's no system by which we could simply opt out of capitalism and then go do something else. Capitalists are always utilizing that threat of implicit violence in order to get you to agree. So, like we said, sometimes capitalists like to take this sort of tack where they say, well, yeah, it's not their fault that starvation is a necessary part of nature, and they're not using that as a threat against you. But what I've tried to compare it to before is, imagine that you are like, you've like got your ankle, you're climbing up a volcano, okay, and you get your ankle stuck while climbing the volcano, and it erupts. And lava begins coming down the side of the volcano. Let's just neglect the fact that you're probably screwed if that's happening. But let's just, entertain my thought experiment for me. And somebody comes by and they find you with your ankle stuck there. And they say to you, well, I'll free you from that spot, but you have to essentially become a slave to me. You have to labor precisely as I say, and you have to serve me, and you have to give me the products of your labor precisely as I say, under my stipulations. I think we can all recognize that just because they didn't cause the volcano to erupt, just because they didn't cause the lava to come sliding down the side of the mountain, that they are still coercing you in that process. They're using this natural threat in order to get you to agree to something you would never agree to freely. And that is the fundamental relation in capitalism. That's what's always taking place. They are always fundamentally exploiting that you have no alternative other than to starve. So that's a little bit of why it is inherently coercive. And this is why that their conception of a non-aggression principle at the heart of anarcho-capitalism is a falsehood. It's a lie. It's made up, because fundamentally that is an act of aggression. Capitalism is an act of aggression. Okay, and so some people might be listening to this and saying, "Well, what's the alternative? Like, how else can you do it?" And the answer is, you don't have to have businesses and the factories and the means of production owned by private entities. Private property is inherently, at its very base, it is about gatekeeping the things that that person did not create. Because the capitalist didn't create the factory, right? The capitalists didn't create the factory with their own two hands and then make all the widgets that it creates and then box those up and then drive the trucks to the location and then sell them and then also be the person in the retail outlet that they didn't do any of that. They literally just get the proceeds because the legal fiction of law allows it to them, because there is an armed force of violence which will defend the legal fiction for the capitalists. The capitalists rely upon this threat of violence, which is to say utilization of the state's police and military, in order to make sure that nobody gets to, question their ownership of those things. And so here, I suppose what we should do is we should try to discern between private property and personal property. These often get really mixed up in this conversation. And this is because anarcho-capitalists or American libertarians try to mix up these terms. But personal property is that which you immediately use and apprehend. Okay? Private property is that which you own simply by claim. And that claim could be done in a bunch of different ways, but it always boils down to that claim is enforced through threat of violence. So, for example, your toothbrush, that's personal property. You own that because you use it. Your home, that's personal property. You own that because you use it. But a factory, you don't run the factory by yourself. The factory has to be run by, dozens of people, all of them with particular tasks at hand that they know how to do, and the factory wouldn't run without them. Therefore, that factory can't be your personal property. You do not run the factory alone. You do not use the factory alone. And where something is used by multiple people, then that becomes all of their personal property in this sense. And this is what I'm explaining here is an understanding you might call usufruct, which is that property should be owned by those who use it. So this gives us the understanding of why in socialist and communist anarchist theory that we want to socialize the means of production. We're trying to eliminate this arbitrary claim over all of these things that is only enforced through violence under capitalism. And we are instead trying to create an organic understanding of ownership, which takes into account where everything came from and regards that the products of people's labor, that all of the things around us that we own are the products of people's labor. So this takes us to the next step of complication here, and that is everything we do affects other people, right? So the house that I live in, yes, indeed, I may be the one that lives in it, and it is my personal property by that measure, but I probably didn't build it by myself. There was probably a lot of people that built it. And the same thing with the factory. And the same thing with those widgets that the factory makes. Probably somebody came up with the idea for how those widgets actually work and the process that factory uses. And, this is true for most things in society. So this leads us through socialism and into communism, that is to say, social ownership. Everybody is part of a social fabric wherein they are contributing to all of the things in society. So I only bring this up to help understand what the anarchist perspective on these things is. This is how the anarchist views these things. But the anarcho-capitalist essentially says it's okay for you to own anything so long as that it is your private property. And how is private property, defined? Private property is basically just defined as that which you have gotten through voluntary exchange. But as we've discussed, there is no such thing as voluntary exchange under capitalism. Capitalism relies upon coercion at its very base. And number two, when we look at like everything that it would be contained under this, what we see is that, these factories and everything are really, once again, held through threat of violence, right? That's really what's happening at the basis here. The basis is that the capitalist is saying, this is mine because I can marshal violence to make sure that it's mine. And you will honor the coerced exchange that I got it through because I will kill you otherwise. I will use private armies and private militias in order to make sure that this is enforced. That gets us sort of this next part. Let's talk about why what they want wouldn't even be a good society. Okay, they want a society that has no state, but where all of these capitalist hierarchies essentially just don't get to run wild. So what we see is that when there is no checks on an economic system, that what tends to happen is you get mergers or destruction. So you get competition and they try to destroy each other, and then they either destroy one another or they merge. These are pretty much their two main capacities. And as mergers take place, monopolies grow. And as monopolies grow, the little guy has less and less of a chance to enter the field and do anything significant. That's number one. That's just sort of an economic reasoning as to why this doesn't work. So anarcho-capitalism would just lead to enormous monopolies. That would be one of the problems. But then what would also take place is because capitalism relies on threat of violence, then essentially what you're going to get is these private armies and private courts and all of this essentially just recreating all of the functions of the state. And this is why I often say that anarcho-capitalism is just a recipe for neo-feudalism, right? We're essentially going to recreate a system where what you have is the lordly class, aka the owners of capital, the owners of the means of production, the owners of private entities. And then you're gonna have the laboring class, the people who just own their own labor. And the problem is, as monopoly grows, a smaller and smaller group of people become the owners. And so what you do is you create a steeper and steeper and steeper pyramid, where at the very bottom you have the masses of people. You have 99.99999% of people that all they can do is labor. Where you essentially just have a private army which does the will of this lordly class, and then all you really do is you create some sort of dystopian cyberpunk feudalism. It's like Shadowrun or something. It sounds like a hell society. It sounds like a truly horrifying society. It's a society where there would be, company towns that would determine everything, where everybody would be subjugated laborers, and this aristocracy of capital would reign supreme over everything, and there would be no competition. There would be absolute monopolization of everything. And I think in many capacities, insofar as this were even allowed to play out for a period of time, it would probably only last for a very short period of time as they recreated the entity of the state wholesale and just returned to something like some kind of minarchism, which would slowly evolve into maybe some kind of like neoliberal technocratic state that would essentially carry out the whims of capital, and it would be a mediator for the conflict between capital, because that's another aspect we haven't gotten to. Like in feudalism, you would get these conflicts between the lordly class, between people within the lordly class that want more and more and more for themselves, that want to monopolize more and more and more, okay? And they would do this through use of private armies, just as the lordly class did. And these private armies would enforce their claims. And they would say that all they're doing is defending themselves. This is their claim to private property here, okay? And that just sounds like a horrific society. That sounds like a society of utter destitution, of utter concentration of wealth, and there's no reason any of us should want that, and that has no similarity to anarchism. Anarchism does not mean anything goes. That is not what anarchism means. Anarchism does not just mean opposition to the state. Anarchism is the opposition to all hierarchical power structures. And these examples, these are why that the anarchist is opposed to all hierarchical power structures, because that is the behavior of hierarchical power structures, monopolization of power. Okay, hierarchical power structures don't care about your non-aggression principle. They're going to act by those dictates which further their accumulation of power. And so anarcho-capitalism is made up. Anarcho-capitalism is a hoax at best. It really, to me, I think was just an attempt to spread a sort of neoliberal, deregulationist agenda under the current capitalist system, sort of giving people what they thought was a radical ideology, but was really just a way to get them to want to deregulate the private services, the private sector in society, to remove regulations and for people to support their own subjugation by capital, because it focused all of its attention on the state. And so it made people into anti-statists, but it didn't make people into, it didn't give people a foundation for anti-domination. So what it did is it ended up just serving the needs of, huge billionaire conglomerates like Koch Industries. And really that's all it is. It's an ideology which is meant to dupe normal people, to dupe the populace into supporting a capitalist aristocracy and the deregulation and destruction of the state, so that capitalist aristocracy can establish absolute control. And in the process, it's a double whammy. This is why it was kind of genius, okay? Is that it also destroyed the very movement that would have given lie to it, which is to say anarchism, or didn't destroy it, but it sabotaged the movement that would have given the lie to it, which is anarchism or libertarian socialism, which essentially tore all of it. Anarchism tore anarcho-capitalism apart before anarcho-capitalism ever came into existence. All of the arguments of the anarcho-capitalists were destroyed before the anarcho-capitalists ever made them. They're only appealing to people that have not inspected anarchism more broadly and don't know about anarchism more broadly, because anarchism provides all of the arguments to destroy anyone's support for anarcho-capitalism. And I have given a small shred of the critiques that are available against anarcho-capitalism. So I just thought I would make this video talking about some of the broad, sweeping, criticisms here, why anarcho-capitalism isn't anarchist. With that, if you liked the video, click like. If you are interested in more rambling, videos like this one, subscribe to my channel. And if you have anything you want to say for or against, just go down into the comments and give me a comment. I assume there probably will be comments, given anarcho-capitalists like to get real angry about anybody criticizing them. And lastly, if you want to support the channel and the work that I'm doing here, I just want to tell you that right now is like a really crucial juncture in the future of the channel. The Patreon and my income from the Patreon is really very close. I think within the next half a year to a year or something, I could actually start doing this channel full time. So understand that if you become a patron right now, it will actually make a real concrete difference in my life. So I appreciate all of you becoming patrons. And that's it, I guess. That's the spiel. Hope y'all enjoyed that video, and I'll see you next time.